Welcome, developers, on this episode on programming with SimConnect. And this time we're going to talk about events in Microsoft Flight Simulator. So last time or actually not just last time, way back already, we dealt with events. In part 2, we looked briefly at system events. And then last time we looked at input events, and they were used to respond to key presses. In this part, we'll take a more detailed look at events. Events, as they come in, will notify us of things that have happened. This means that we cannot decide we don't want it to happen. It already has happened, but we may try to keep it hidden. For example, the user did something on the keyboard or on the controller, and we want to do something based on that. Or a button was pushed in the cockpit, or some add-on has fired a custom command, because you can add your own commands if you want. And yes, I said masking events. We can prevent the simulator from making all events that we get be sent on. The simulator sends events to subscribers, and they are sent one by one. Events are put into groups, and that group priority determines where in the chain this event will be delivered to our application. A subscriber can give a group a maskable priority, and if you give it a maskable priority, you can mark individual events in that group as being masked. This means that though you get the event, the next one in line, the one with a lower priority, will not get it. The simulator itself has a default priority only. And yes, that means you can prevent the simulator from seeing events. And that sounds pretty interesting, but you have to be very careful with that, because you cannot decide on the fly and say, oh, this event, yes, I said I wanted it maskable, but this particular one I want to send on. And of course, the other thing we can do with events is generate them. We can simulate a key push, a button push, or a click spot on screen. And we may want to send specific add-on events, say an event from a PMDG 777. Or we want to control an AI SimObject. Again, a few examples. A complex add-on has a cockpit with lots of knobs and buttons and even some hidden click spot, and you want to simulate interaction with them. If the maker of that add-on has documented the events, like they've done with PMDG, then you can actually send those events yourself. And we might have some tool that acts as a smart device or a smart assistant, and it will monitor what's happening in your aircraft and then do things. And yes, this means you could potentially use this, for example, to build your own Copilot. So that notification group, that is the first thing you need to do. Notification groups in our applications, just like all the other things we've discussed about, or most other things we've discussed about previously, in your application, they're just numbers. Those numbers are for your client, and they will only be valid in your app. These groups, you can give a priority for all events in the group. There is a standard priority called SimConnect Group Priority Lowest, and it has a specific value, which is actually quite high. And unfortunately, this is a bit confusing, but it says lowest, but it's a high value, and a lower priority has a higher value than this. So if you use a value higher than SimConnect Group Priority Lowest, then it will have a lower priority. There is a SimConnect Group Priority Default, which has a value halfway down from lowest. And then there is a standard priority, which is a bit below and therefore has a higher priority than default. And of course, the highest priority is not 0, but 1. The simulator will in fact assign the next available priority. And this has to do with the fact that the simulator wants to send those events to the different subscribers one by one. So it needs to have an absolute ordering. So if you ask for your group to get a default priority, actually what happens is that SimConnect will then find the next priority that is unused and use that. Unfortunately, it won't tell you which priority you just got. Then you map or create your client event. Client events, again, are just numbers, and these numbers are valid in your app. This means you can have a client event with number 1, and another app can also have a client event with number 1, and they will be different. You map your client event to a simulator event by name. There is a page in the SDK documentation. It's called Key Events, and this is the page where you get an index of all standard events. There are some subpages, and those subpages will provide more details. Those details may include information on potential data sent along with the event. You put your client event into a notification group. The simulator then knows when, if you get it, and it also knows who can receive it if you send it. So that is why you need to use notification groups. It's not something that you should skip. Now, about those masking events, there is a special notification group priority called Priority Highest Maskable, and this is then the priority that you would set on your group. As usual, the simulator will assign the next available number, and events can then be added to the group, and there is a separate parameter that by default is false, Boolean parameter that makes it maskable. So if you put it to true, then that event will be sent to you, but not by anyone later down the chain. And be careful, as I already said, there is no way to unmask a maskable event. This problem is a bit larger than you might expect. You might say, okay, then I can just resend it. The problem is it will start again at the top of the chain unless you send it in a group which has a different priority, so it starts somewhere in the chain. But the thing is, because you don't know exactly what priority you were assigned, so you don't know the exact position, you cannot ensure that everyone that is behind you will also get it. So be very careful with masking events. As I already noted, many events have a payload. We've already seen system events with Boolean and string values, and there are also events with numeric values. For example, flap, rudder, ailerons, and elevator, and then you get a number showing how far in between 0 and a maximum value that those flaps or rudders have been set. There are also some events that have two. For example, the mixture set event has an engine number as well as a value. But of course, and this is also something that comes from the past, sometimes the name has the second value. For example, you don't have just mixture set, you also have mixture 1 set through mixture 4 set. This, of course, assumes there are at most 4 engines where you can set mixture. There are some aircraft where this would be a problem, so be careful with using these. And then there are complex values in text. And if you take a look in the list of events and then look in the category for airship events, you will see that there are actually quite a lot of them, and they can have a string payload, and the payload actually is a structured value. And yes, this is something of a facepalm thing because this is a definite anti-pattern. I mean, it works, but then just make more complex events with data in them, I would say. But anyway, who am I? Now, of course, the big question is, I have events, but I also have SimObject data. So how do these correspond to each other? For example, we have flaps. We can get an event about flaps being set, but we can also get SimObject data on the current state of the flaps. That is because events generally signify the action taken by the pilot. So the event values concern what is set or requested. So the value will indicate where, for example, the flap handle or the throttle handle is set. That doesn't necessarily mean that immediately the aircraft has already taken the appropriate action on this. SimVar data will show the result. It will show, for example, where actually is the handle, because you could use a smooth value between 0 and 100% or 0 and 16384 to take a random value and say, this is where I put the handle. But if that is not a flap detent, then actually what will happen is that the value will go to the nearest detent. Then with flaps, of course, we have leading edge sleds as well as trailing edge flaps. And we have them on the left and on the right side on each wing. There might be multiple trailing edge flaps. SimVar data can show you those results. So it can show you actually the moving or the animation, so to speak, of those flaps. So how do you make a choice? Well, if you want to control what happens to your plane, use those events. If you want to control what is visually shown, use SimVars. And generally, for making changes, the preferred way is to use those events. Now, of course, the next question is, I might have multiple events for the same kind of action. Take the simple example of flaps. I have flaps set. This actually doesn't set the flaps to the setting that you give it, because that is a value between 0 and, yes, 16,383 actually, but it will snap to the closest setting. So you have to use the SimVar to find out what actually happened with what you did. There is, however, also a flaps continuous set. This will allow any value to be set, but I mean, that's kind of weird, because usually with flaps, you don't have all those different values. Then there is an axis flaps set. And this has a bit of a different background, because this has to do usually with what controllers do. And controllers tend to have not a range from 0 to plus maximum, but from minus maximum to plus maximum. So axis flap set lets you set a value between minus 16,364 and plus 16,383. And I think that should have been minus 384. Sorry for the typo. And in case you want to know, that is actually 14 bits values. Then we have additional events for flaps up and down. This means fully up and down. You can just send one event and that will set the flaps fully up or fully down. And we have incr and decr for increment and decrement, which will give us the next or previous setting. And yes, actually, for continuous, we also have an increment and a decrement. Then we have flaps 1 through flaps 4. And this is not because we have potentially 4 flaps. It's the first 4 settings. Actually, I found out that flaps 4 was not recognized. So there might be a bit of a bug in 2024. But generally, you wouldn't use flaps 1 to flaps 4, but rather use increment, decrement, or up and down. There was also a flaps detent set. This is no longer supported, which actually would be a preferable alternative to flaps 1 through 4. And Note that flaps set in the documentation specifies 0 to 16383. And it also says that is 0 to 100%. And of course, what they mean to say is that the value you specify is 0 to 16383. And what they mean is 0 to 100. So if you want 50% setting, then you need to go to 8191. So what about add-ons? There is actually no requirement of which event should be supported by an add-on in the SDK documentation that I have found, unless it is somewhere in the parts about how to build your own aircraft. But from the past, I've seen that there are different ways of how to interact. For example, there are some add-ons that prefer to use simvars and then the so-called local simvars or lvars. They used to be add-on local, which meant that if you have an external program connecting through SimConnect, you cannot even request the current value. But in 2024, that was at a certain moment posed. So nowadays you actually can request the local simvars. The documentation about these, of course, is part of the add-ons documentation, so you have to look at them. And some of them actually introduce their own events. And yes, the PMDG aircraft tend to do this. So they have data. They don't use simvars, they use client data, and I'll come to that later on. But if you want to change something, then you should use the events, and they're documented in their header file. Then the actual messages that you are going to receive, there are several. The SimConnect receive event struct have just a dayword data field, 1 for the event, and I think it's 5 for the extended one. But there's also receive event file name, which actually extends from receive event, which contains a string parameter that can contain a file name path. And there is an event frame one, which contains frame rate information, also extending from receive event. Then there are several multiplayer events. There are SimObject add remove events that we used last time when we were replaying a recorded piece of trip with our aircraft. And there are race and race lab events. Those actually are only the end events. So let's take a look at a small application subscribing to events. Okay, let's take a look at this little application we have here. It's based on the usual code that you can find. So it does a connect, then it does setup keys. That's mostly the same one that we had in the previous part. Number 7, it's just to get a key to be able to stop the application. And then we do a subscribe to events. After that, we handle messages with no duration specified, so it will handle until the stop key is pressed. Okay, let's take a look here. Subscribe to events, and of course I've expected that because what I did here was subscribe to all events that are concerned with flaps. And I've commented out flaps 4 because I found out that if I uncomment this one, I will get an error that it doesn't know about flaps 4, which is of course ridiculous. But anyway, not important, we can live without it. Subscribe to event itself is pretty straightforward. It first maps a client event to that sim event, then it gets the last sent packet ID, so we have that in case we get an exception thrown. So we print that out, and then we add our client event to the notification group. And also there we get the last sent packet ID, because I like to know what goes wrong if I get an exception. So we go further up. Setup keys, I'll show you the contents this time. It's the same like previous, but now we're first creating the event using a non-existent name. This is especially for when you want to capture input events. And it's not a flight simulator event because it has a dot in the name. That's a very simple thing to do. If you want to create your own event names, give them a dot in the name, and then the flight simulator will not mistake it for anything it uses. Then we need to map it, the input event, to the client event. And in this case, it's the virtual key of the media key block, the stop key. So on my keyboard, that is a key with this little white rectangle or a square on it, which means stop. And then I set it on, so I actually want to receive events on this input group. And then I add the client event to the notification group, and I set the notification group priority. So you see, this is quite a lot we need to do, and that is mostly to do with the keyboard specialities. There's a complete list of all the virtual keys that you can bind, and it's very interesting, but be careful because, of course, keys might also be bound in Flight Simulator itself. And it doesn't really mind if two things have been bound to the same input event, because the input event is just sent to everyone who's listening. And that, of course, is why you might want to use something like a maskable event, because then you can handle it and then say, I've dealt with it, nobody else should bother with it. As long as it's just the simulator that is dealing with that input event, that will work. Okay, let's go up. Here we have the usual loop for getting the messages. And I'm not going to show you the code for exceptions, open and quit, but we have here a handler for event and event extended 1. And then we're going to get from the message the event ID, and then just give us some information about this. If it's an unknown event, we're just ignoring it. Okay, that's all there is to it. So let's go and have a look. And we're going into part 8, 8-1, and then go to the directory where the compiled version is. And we're going to start our application. Okay, you see here that it it says press escape key. Of course, that has to be the stop key. Sorry about that. I'll fix that and push that out to GitHub. And then here we get messages for all the different events that we're now subscribed to. And it gets an open message, so it's connected to Flight Simulator. Flight Simulator is running, and now we can do things in Flight Simulator. So let's switch to the Flight Simulator. Here it is. And I'll show you the first thing, very simple. You see here on the right, we have the flaps button. I'm not going to use that. Instead, I'm going to use a flaps button on my controller and just do a one-step flaps down. And you see, first of all, we received a flaps incr event, and you also saw it changing in the cockpit, and we can do it again. And now it's down. I can do it again, but now nothing is happening. So you see here the event was sent because it was sent from the driver or from the controller handler, but the aircraft didn't do anything with it. And the other way around, of course, will work. Now let's do it from here. So I'm getting it and doing it like that. And you see, we did not receive a flaps increment event. Let's see what happens if I use the mouse wheel instead. Again, the UI is changing, things are happening there. So this is simply a limitation in the DA62 add-on. They didn't let it actually generate those events. Okay, let's push the stop button, and you see that worked. Okay, so now we've seen how to subscribe to events, and we've seen a few examples of what happens. And there are things that you need to be careful about. You should always make sure to add events to a notification group that I already mentioned before, but let's repeat that because it's really important. And you also saw that actually events sent from the cockpit UI are not guaranteed to create events that are sent to all the SimConnect subscribers. For example, it's dependent on the add-on maker what happens. The Inibuilds A320, I tested that. It sends flap set events while you're moving the handle in the cockpit. But the DA62 that we just saw, we could move that button in the cockpit, but we didn't receive any events. Okay, now given that we've subscribed and seen how that works, let's take a look at a bit of code where we can send our own events. Okay, so let's take a look at sending events, and I like that a bit better because it gives me some more possibilities to do some nice things. And let's start with the code. If you take a look here, it starts the same, but now we are going to gather the command line arguments. This gather args was also used in previous applications. Take a look. It's a pretty neat function that puts everything into a map. And we're just going to use two positional arguments, arg1 and arg2. So if we must have a first argument. If not, we don't have an event name. Then it gets the event name as the first argument. Then it checks, do we have a second one? If we do, then it will try to interpret that as a value. So it can be just a number or a hexadecimal number. And it will put that into a D-word variable. Then we get the usual code for connecting, setting up the keyboard keys, and then send event. So let's take a look at send event. It's here. And send event does the map client event to sim event, and then print the last packet ID in case we get any exceptions. Then it will add the client event to the notification group. And we need to do that to make sure that simulator knows who can receive our event. Then we're going to print out, then we're going to transmit a client event. And there is also an EX1 version of this where you can add multiple dwords as data. We're just giving one. We're going to send it to the SimObject of the user, which is our aircraft, then our client event, and the value within this group. And it's being sent with no special flags. Okay, so that's all it does. So let's see what this does in practice. So here we are back in our simulator, and we'll go to the code 8-2. And we're going to say send event, and we want to do a flaps up. Now, flaps up is just up to the utmost position, no value additionally needed. And you see our flaps immediately went to up. And we can do the same, of course, with down. And you see it immediately goes all the way to the down position. Oh, 1D too many. And this is just one step. You see this works pretty neatly. We could do flaps set. If we just give it no parameter, it will send out a 0, which is, of course, fully up. And we could give it the 16383, which should be the highest value. And yeah, it's actually going all the way down. Let's see what happens if we take something like this. And yeah, that's halfway. So pretty neat, a very small program, and probably very useful to do some experimenting with. We can do it with others as well. All you need actually is just take a look at the documentation, and there is a long list of events that we can take. Let's see if there is an interesting one. Just take power here. Master is called, I think. Here we can say master battery off. Okay. Let's see what happens if we do a master battery off. And yeah, that had the effect we expected because it was on battery and now that's off. So everything shut down. Okay, I think this is enough for this demo. Okay, that was, I think, an interesting way to test it. It's a nice program. It's on GitHub, and take a look. So let's wrap this up. Events are very powerful for controlling aircraft and reacting to inputs. You can mask or intercept events. This prevents some other listeners from seeing the event, but unfortunately, you cannot really predict who will and who will not receive that event. This is because you don't know number how many in the list of receivers you were, and you don't know who else is behind you. But at least you can make sure that the simulator doesn't get that event. The most useful applications, in my opinion, is intercepting keys or buttons on controllers and then controlling SimObjects. Remember that record and playback? For example, we could record what we did with flaps and then use that to set the flaps when we play it back. So if we're looking at the aircraft and we see it move, it sets the flaps and we actually see it doing that. Okay, that's it for this lesson. And thank you for your attention. As usual, all the code is on GitHub. Take a look there. And I think the next lesson will go back to C++ and the C++ library and take a look at some things that I'm building there to support the data and events. And also I've been playing around with a background connection manager. So if you do want to use multi-threading, then you can just let this background thread take care of making the connection to the simulator and receiving and dispatching messages. As usual, again, I do this for the subs and likes. So if you feel like it, please do give me one of those, and I'll see you in the next one.